Yes?
So the choice of giving Lev the name that is so similar to yours, do your grandparents actually live in Sarasota, Florida? And is there any reason that you named the characters opposed to
My grandparents did live in Florida. They're not alive anymore, and yeah, it's a different spelling. It's a little bit played with, but no, I mean, as well, I don't want to give anything away, but as I tell people who ask me about it, my grandmother was the best cook I ever knew. So it is a work of fiction. It's a novel. It's a work of fiction. I don't want to be yelled at by Oprah or anything. It's definitely a work of fiction. That said, I mean, there are definitely elements of truth in there, elements from my own family history, but they're scant. They're scant. And well, I was going to say something very interesting, which I'm now blanking on. Yeah, they're both passed away for some time, so unfortunately they weren't around to read the book and tell me what they thought was wrong with it. Yes?
To go slightly on the topic of this book, can you tell us how you came to write this screenplay for Kite Runner?
I read the book. I was sent the book by someone who knew they were going to make a movie, and at my agent basically, and I loved it, and I wanted the job, and they went off to a different writer. They hired a different writer, so I didn't get the job, and it was too bad. But those are the breaks. And then about a year later, apparently this other writer, who's actually a brilliant writer, but he never wrote anything because the producers called him and they said, "Is the script ready?" Or they called the agent, and the agent said, "Not yet, but he's 2 weeks off." And 2 weeks passed, and they said, "Okay, is the script ready?" And they said, "Well, he'll have it by the end of the week." And so Friday came, and they said, "The script ready?" And they said, "Here in England," there's an English writer, "here in England, end of the week means Monday." So they said, "Okay." I called on Monday. I can't find the writer. We've lost track of him. Don't know where he is. And it turned out he just hadn't been able to do it. And so the book came back around, and so I got another chance at it. And I went in and basically had to pitch against. There were 4 other writers who wanted the same project, and I had to sort of tell my interpretation of it to the producers, which was essentially very faithful. I mean, I love the book. I just thought the book shouldn't be tampered with too much. There are certain changes you have to make because anytime you're taking a long novel and trying to turn it into a 2-hour movie, you have to cut certain things and make other changes. But I didn't want to screw with it very much at all. And then I met with Khaled Hosseini, which was kind of nerve-wracking because we had this lunch and I sat down. I thought there was going to be kind of the half-hour small talk before you really get into it. And he said, "So, David, tell me, what do you think are the structural challenges of adapting Kite Runner?" It was nerve-wracking, and we talked for a long time, and he seemed to end up liking what I said, and I got the job. And he was a wonderful resource throughout because he's a real he's a great man. I mean, he's a real gentleman, but he's also someone who understood that he's a big movie buff, and he knew that certain things would have to be cut, certain things would have to be changed, and he was never antagonistic to the process at all. In fact, he was quite an ally because I didn't grow up in Afghanistan. I'm not Muslim, so I don't have the background that you need to really tell the story accurately. And whenever I came across a situation where I didn't know how things would really go, I could call him or more often email him because I work very late at night and he's a doctor who wakes up early. And I'd send these emails saying, "So how would you enter a mosque, in Kabul in the 1970s? What was the protocol? What were the rituals?" And he would send back a very, thought-out reply, and it was a great partnership, and he was really a wonderful guy to work with. It's a lot of pressure adapting a living writer because you really don't want to let them down. And I've adapted some other books by writers who are dead where it's a little bit less, you're not worried so much about offending them. But with Khaled and with a couple of the other people that I've adapted who haven't yet been made into movies, you're nervous about them reading it and what their reaction is going to be. Because at the end of the day, I mean, I loved working on that movie, and I really loved the book so much. But an adaptation is almost like it's not a creative work as much as I think a work of translation. You're taking a book and you're trying to take someone else's story and someone else's characters and make it work on screen. So it's almost like you're translating into a cinematic language, and I didn't want to try to mess with something that works so beautifully on the page. Yes, sir.
Without giving away the book itself, for people that haven't read it, what would you want somebody to take away from reading the book as far as learning about themselves, or other than just enjoyment of reading the book? What would you hope to see they would gain from a worldly perspective or just a personal perspective from reading the book itself?
It's a good question. I mean, you know, I don't start off when I'm writing a book thinking like, what message do I want to give to a reader? I hope that if you write a good enough story, the message will take care of itself, you know, and sometimes it's a little bit incoherent. Like sometimes I think that the only way to really summarize the message of a book is to actually read the thing in its entirety, you know. But that said, I mean, there are a number of different things, both kind of literal and a little bit more abstract. On the literal sense, like when I started researching this, I really knew very little about the war on the Eastern Front. Growing up in America, my education about the war was all about our involvement in the war, and so you really think of the climactic battle of the war being D-Day and everything else. And while that was obviously one of the key battles, the real turning point in terms of when the Wehrmacht was stopped was Stalingrad, and the Eastern Front was where. And this was the most fearsome army in history. You know, they had not lost a battle. When they invaded Russia, they were seen as unstoppable. They penetrated incredibly deeply into the country within just a few months. And by September of 1941, they had encircled Leningrad. And, you know, everyone in Russia, including Stalin and everyone else, they thought Leningrad was doomed. They basically gave up on it. And the city, France lasted, I don't know, I can't remember how many days France lasted before the Germans conquered it. Leningrad lasted 900 days and never surrendered and never gave up. And when you read the diaries of the people who lived through the siege, which ended up being the most useful thing for me in terms of the research, because the history books, and one of them in particular, the 900 Days by Harrison Salisbury, is a brilliant history and was greatly useful. But the books that were most useful for me as a writer of the story were the diaries of the survivors, because they talked about the day-to-day struggle of people trying to make it through the siege. And the history books tend to be about the great movements of the armies and the leaders like Stalin and Hitler, whereas the diaries are really focused on how people found food that day and how they managed to get some warmth, how they found something to burn. But what was truly inspiring, aside from their survival, was that they never abandoned their culture and they never abandoned their humor. So you just find these incredibly funny moments in the diaries where these people they have this very distinctive Russian black humor, which I found so inspiring. And the same thing when I interviewed survivors. You know, these people would be talking about what you would think were the most grim and awful circumstances, and yet they would say, they tell the stories in very self-deprecating ways and with a great deal of humor. And I really wanted to get that into the story because I didn't want it just to be a kind of a catalog of atrocity. I wanted to show how they retained their spirit. And beyond just the humor, the fact that they kept going to concerts, they kept going to theater, they kept reading. Midway through the siege, the Russian government, the Leningrad city government rather, printed hundreds of thousands of copies of War and Peace on very cheap paper, and they were distributed to the city, to the citizens of the city, and it was almost like a very it's bizarre. It was almost like this macabre citywide book club, you know, where everyone was reading the same book, and it was happened to be a very relevant book because it's about the Napoleonic invasion of Russia, another failed invasion that was stopped and allowed the Russians to reconquer the country. So anyway, this is a very, very long answer to a fairly simple question, but it was one of the things that inspired me that I wanted to try to get across in the book was this, not just the fact that they didn't give up, but that they also retained their souls. So I guess that was, you know, in terms of message, that's something that really struck me when I met with the people who lived there, and also when I read the diaries. I'll stop now with that answer.